Hello everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon or this evening, depending of course on where you are. We're really excited by today's webinar, which as you know is on the topic of incident command or incident management systems and their application to humanitarian, overseas humanitarian work. The place that we're coming from with this, just to give a little bit of background as to why we wanted to have this webinar, is that, as many of you all know, over the last 3 years, ALNAP's been looking a lot at some of the problems and challenges of operational leadership, an issue which comes up very often in many of the evaluations and much of the research as being a real difficulty for humanitarian organizations in terms of the effectiveness of response. And we've taken a fairly broad definition of leadership, which has really been about, asking how in an emergency do humanitarians identify the vision for what a good response is meant to be, and then allocate resources, prioritize resources to achieve that vision. And how is that process managed over time, over the life of the response? So it's those things. It's the identification of a vision, identification of a strategy, and management of the strategy over the life of the response, which is how we've determined leadership. And one of the things that we were very keen to do was look outside our own goldfish bowl, as it were, and look for demonstrated best practice from other areas to inform what works in terms of leadership of this type. But the problem that we had was that a lot of the classical leadership literature and a lot of the the kind of stuff that if you go into the bookshop in the management section or pull down off the shelf wasn't really relevant, partly because frankly often it's not very well researched. It's more assertion than research in many cases, although not all, but also because the leadership literature is largely from the corporate world, which, whilst it has its own challenges, doesn't necessarily align very well with our humanitarian context. What we were looking for was leadership, that is the vision, the strategy, and the implementation, in very specific circumstances, in circumstances where information is limited, there's a lot of it, but it's not necessarily the right kind of information for making decisions, where lives are at stake, where there's intense media and political attention, and where you have a large number of different actors who are all sort of working across, often, across around the globe, so with different levels, different actors working at different levels behind a response. That's a very particular situation, and one that we found was not replicated in many other sectors. But luckily, one sector, that is the world's fire service and civil defense agencies, have of course been working in very, very similar conditions for many years, and have put an awful lot of work and time and thought into considering the best way of dealing with these circumstances and of conducting leadership and management in these circumstances. And collectively, this set of learning and practice from fire and civil defense is often thought of as incident command or incident management systems. And that was a very rich learning resource for us in terms of kind of identifying what was demonstrably research-based best practice in leading emergency response. So we've learned a lot in terms of the ALNAP research from the Incident Command, Incident Management, ICS, IMS. And one of the interesting things that we learned was that the basic principles of ICS are often actually being practiced in the humanitarian field on the ground, but it's often been that where they're being practiced, it hasn't necessarily been something that people have been taught. It's more just been a question of trial and error and people developing these best practices on a case-by-case, country-by-country basis. And so we thought, rather than this ad hoc and informal learning around ICS, it would be great if we could learn more from practitioners of ICS and build more of a dialogue between international humanitarians and ICS, IMS practitioners. And today's webinar is part of that process, we hope. Before going any further, I'd just like to ask you to conduct, if we might conduct a small poll, just to find out how much experience our audience, our participants have with either practicing ICS or learning around ICS. So, if you take a look now at your screen, you will find 5 options, and if you could just click on the option which most closely approximates to your experience of knowledge of ICS, that'll give us a feeling of kind of, who's in the room, and it will help our speakers also identify the level of explanation they need to give to certain topics. So we'll just leave that open as more and more people join the webinar for a few minutes. And I will just use those 2 minutes to introduce today's speakers. We are absolutely delighted and honoured that Arne and Joe have agreed to present this webinar today. Joseph Pfeifer is the Chief of Counterterrorism and Emergency Preparedness for the New York Fire Department, FDNY. He's commanded some of the largest fires and emergencies in the department's history, and he directs the FDNY Center for Terrorism and Disaster Preparedness. We were actually, before the webinar started, having a very interesting conversation about FDNY and New York City in general's preparations around the global Ebola response. Joe is a program affiliate and visiting fellow of the Program on Crisis Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also a senior fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. He holds a Master's in Public Administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School, a Master's in Security Studies from the Naval Postgraduate School, and a Master's in Theology from Immaculate Conception. A very interesting trinity of postgraduate study there, Joe. He writes frequently and is published in various books and journals. Arnold M. Howitt, is the Executive Director of the Roy and Leela Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at HKS, the Harvard Kennedy School, with responsibility for its executive education and research programs. He also co-directs the Program on Crisis Leadership and co-founded the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. Dr. Howitt's research focuses on public management and intergovernmental policy implementation, particularly emergency preparedness and disaster management. He's conducted research or consulted for public agencies at the federal, state and local levels and lectures widely on these subjects. He's also served on a number of national and state advisory panels. I really can't imagine a more knowledgeable pair of speakers than Arne and Joe, and as I say, we're delighted that they have joined us today. Before I hand over the results of the poll so far, 38% have minimal knowledge, 17% know the basics but don't have operational experience, 2% know a lot but have no operational experience, 13% have non-humanitarian operational experience, and interestingly 31% have had experience using ICS in humanitarian contexts. So it's a diverse group, and we're very, very interested to hear some of the questions and ideas that you can type in on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll see a box there. We'll be collecting those, and we're putting your ideas and your questions to Joe and Arne in a minute. So more than enough of me. I'm going to hand over now, with no further ado, to Arnold Howitt to tell us more about ICS. Arne.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and to have the opportunity to speak to the many people out there in the audience. Joe and I have put together a short presentation, and then we will be, which will explain some of the basics of incident command or incident management. We'll use the terms quite interchangeably today, and then we'll be very happy to be answering questions. We live in a world, as all of you know from your professional experience, in which there are many challenges facing us. The photographs on the screen illustrate something of the range of situations that we face. The Indian Ocean tsunami, the wreckage of the World Trade Towers after 9/11, Superstorm Sandy approaching the American coast, a mudslide in China, the wreckage caused by the horrible earthquake in Haiti in 2010, some symbols that signify the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, pictures of severe fire, Japan following the awful earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident, a blackout in the eastern United States, and UN forces trying to keep order after a civil conflict. These challenges stem from some important features of 21st century life. First of all, the tremendous interconnections of human systems, augmented by technologies, but tying together people's lives not only in their own communities, but across their countries and across the globe. Secondly, more and more people in the world and more people living in harm's way in places where they're susceptible to natural disasters or to man-made disasters. The necessity of dealing with these global challenges arises, and we more and more have to deal with these in a cross-boundary fashion, crossing the boundary of organizations, of professional emergency response and humanitarian professions, crossing political boundaries of local, state or provincial and national governments, even international borders for many of the largest disasters. These kinds of challenges are in fact complicated by our modern technology and the possibility of natural disasters setting off technology disasters, as occurred in Japan in 2011 when the earthquake and tsunami created a nuclear disaster as well. Finally, as we look forward, we have all of these factors remaining, but we also have to be prepared for the impacts of climate change, which are likely to make some of our natural events, more severe natural events, more frequent and more intense. So all of this creates the backdrop for the organizational challenges that we face in responding to these kinds of disasters. These are natural disasters, failures of technology or infrastructure and systems, biological emergencies created by emergent infectious disease or other epidemics, the threat of bioterrorism and other acts of terrorism around the globe. As we respond to these kinds of situations, we face organizational challenges, and particularly that of coordination across the many organizations that mobilize in response to emergencies. During crises, as a result, emergency responders often have to work closely with organizations and people with whom they've never before collaborated. This is certainly true even at the city level, where responders may work across organizations, from police to fire to Red Cross to other humanitarian organizations, meeting many people that they have not met before, but needing to work with them under conditions perhaps of intense danger. And certainly when we deal with larger emergencies, certainly when we deal with situations in which international humanitarian responders or others cross borders to provide help to people in need, these issues of coordination become very, very pertinent. Under conditions like this, the huge challenge is being able to operate effectively, to coordinate in order to save lives, to protect property, to deal with the small and large impacts of these kinds of events. How do we do this without endangering the emergency responders or the humanitarian workers, their colleagues at the local level, and the people in the public who are threatened by these emergencies? Today, in talking about the Incident Command System, called ICS, or Incident Management System, abbreviated IMS, which, as I said, we will treat as more or less interchangeable in this circumstance, we want to give a sense of an organizational method that has proven extremely useful in the emergency response community in the United States and a number of other places which have similar systems, as a way of creating the coordination that is essential to effective disaster response. When many organizations come together, they form networks, but those networks may not necessarily be the same. One possibility is that they might be centralized networks with a single commander overseeing all of the organizations or all of the individuals who are mobilized to deal with a disaster. But under the kinds of circumstances that I've been talking about, that central command is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, tends to be inefficient because of the many players, because of the distance between the command structure and the people at the scene of the disaster, and the complexity of the number of people and organizations involved. On the other hand, we might have a random network in which people and organizations are relating to each other in a more or less ad hoc or even helter-skelter method. And that system of randomness is not likely to produce an effective response and may create conditions that will endanger the people affected by the disaster and the responders themselves. Instead, what we want to aim at is something that looks like the cluster network that appears in the middle of the slide that you're looking at now. A cluster network has a center, but it does not have a single node through which everything else goes. There are many different individual organizations or individuals who are linked together, and through mediating institutions or mediating individuals, they relate back to the whole. And so the question that arises is how to achieve a network that will be most effective in dealing with the kinds of situations that we need to deal with in these kinds of emergencies. Incident command or incident management is one answer to that question. As I noted, it's been used widely in emergency services in the United States. It's loosely based on a similar system that's used in the military in the United States. But in civil emergencies, this system emerged about 45 years ago in the early 1970s in California, where it was used for responding to major forest fires, the sort that break out in the United States actually year-round, but most particularly in the late spring and summer months. Almost by definition, in a forest fire, many responders, up to 10,000 or more, will come together to fight the fire, obviously in a place where relatively few people live under or work under ordinary circumstances. And so virtually by definition, the people who come together are unfamiliar with each other, come from many locations, perhaps from many states, and need to coordinate. So the incident command system developed under those circumstances, and what it was intended to be and has proved to be is a template that allows people who come together to very swiftly form an operating organization that defines the roles that they're going to play, that creates rules of the road by which they coordinate with each other, that creates either a tight or a loose hierarchy of authority, and creates a decision-making system that allows for effective response. Since those days in the 1970s, the incident command system has spread to other professions. It has been adopted by urban firefighters, by emergency management personnel. It has been used in hospitals, and it's been used to respond to a variety of emergencies, including blackouts, hurricanes, earthquakes, and the like. In 2002, when the U.S. Congress was preparing the Homeland Security Act in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in September of 2001, the Congress included a provision that declared incident management system as the framework for use in all emergency agencies in the United States, and created incentives for responders to adopt that system, and created some gentle penalties, both of which were intended to push organizations that had not used this system before to adopt it and apply it. It is now a decade and slightly more since that time. Incident management has spread quite widely in the United States. It is still not ubiquitous. It is probably a generation of time will go by before this is completely established in the United States. But we've made a great deal of progress in doing this, so that we have a much higher hope of a coordinated response across organizations, across public agencies, and across jurisdictions in responding to major events. As I've said, this is not a system that dictates exactly how people should respond. It certainly isn't a packaged set of decisions or a how-to manual for fighting disasters. What it is a template for organization, a template that allows for effective planning and effective management of resources, that brings people together in a fashion that allows them to work effectively together rather than bumping elbows, crashing into each other, and perhaps endangering each other. It allows for the integration of diverse responders in a common organizational structure. And as I've suggested, it can operate either in a fairly tight command structure, or it can operate in a much more flexible interagency coordinating device that does not involve rigid command. The basic structure for ICS or IMS is depicted in the slide that I'm showing now. And as we'll describe, this can become much more complicated. Even this basic structure might not be used in simple response situations. At the head of this situation is the incident command. And this term of command makes sense in the context of response by a single organization, especially quasi-military organizations like firefighters or police departments or emergency medical systems. And their reasonably tight command will often be in effect, especially when an incident is relatively small and relatively manageable. There will typically be a single incident commander who will be the first officer on the scene, handing off command to more senior officers who may arrive, say, at the scene of a residential fire or a commercial fire. So as more senior officers arrive, the incident command is handed off. In a relatively simple incident, there may simply be an operations section depicted at the lower left of your screen. These will be the people who are carrying out the response operations. If, say, this is a fire that is a little more complicated, then there may be individuals at the scene who fulfill the responsibilities of the planning section or the logistics section, worrying on the planning side about what the next steps will be as the fire response progresses, and on the logistics side, worrying about how resources will be brought to the scene, equipment, food, sanitary facilities, other kinds of supplies. As an incident gets more complex yet, there will be at least a simple finance and administration section, worrying about keeping track of what personnel are on the scene, whether people are injured, how long people are serving. If assistance comes from other organizations, there will be tracking of which organizations are represented, how long they are there, what resources they brought to the scene, so any financial arrangements that need to be made for compensation can be taken care of. And as an incident gets bigger and bigger, the incident command will get support functions. So there will be a public information officer. someone who is concerned primarily with providing information and announcements to the public. Secondly, a safety officer who has the explicit responsibility for making sure that the operation is carried out in as safe a fashion as possible and calling to the attention of people in operations any safety violations. And finally, a liaison officer who will be the representation of the incident command structure to other city agencies and to other outsiders who may be involved in the response. I'd like to now turn it over to Joe Pfeifer, who will talk a little bit about how incident command is used and speak a little bit more about these four basic elements of the incident command structure: operations, planning, logistics, and finance and administration.
Thank you, Ron. What I'd like to start off with is just thinking of that earlier slide where we saw disasters around the world. As you look at that slide and your own experience, there's this sense of being overwhelmed. These are huge events. These are events where many lives are in danger, and in many of these cases, many people have been killed. The question for us is, can we manage these large events? How do we deal with events that are pushing us to the limits of our capabilities? As you look at this slide, the scary part for me is that out of these dozen pictures, I commanded at probably a third of these. 9/11, I was the first chief at the scene. In Hurricane Sandy, I commanded the largest fire in residential areas in New York City. Had a command role in the blackout of 2003, and as Paul mentioned, I'm currently dealing with the Ebola crisis and how it affects New York. But for us, for the rest of this webinar, how do we deal with this? I think when we look at the disasters are is an environment of convergence. Responders are coming to the scene. Organizations, NGOs are coming to the scene. People are trying to help. And as they try to help, we see an emergence of different nodes or of order starts to be placed into the system. Or what we see, we don't see an order starting naturally to occur from the bottom up. What we see instead is a fragmentation. Different groups are doing their own thing. The danger of that is not only being disorganized and not being efficient, the danger is not having situational awareness of where I can help, who needs my assistance. How can I best bring people together to deal with this crisis? So that's why we have this idea of using a structure, or what we've called an incident command structure that you see up on the screen. Let me give you one example. On 9/11, and I like to use that example because people are familiar with that, because you watched it in real time as it evolved on television. On 9/11, we lost our entire command staff. They were killed by the collapse. And we had to reorganize. And as we were trying to reorganize as a department, literally hundreds of people were converging on the scene. We had fire, people coming in from off-duty. We had police officers. We had emergency medical, hospitals, nurses, doctors. We had steel workers coming in because they had the equipment to cut the steel. We had people bringing in food, people bringing in donations. There was family members we had to deal with. So how do we make sense of this structure And at that time, we believed in incident command, but we never had any experience of dealing with a major event. And we slowly, from the bottom up, adopted this system you see on the screen here. We had to bring order to this convergence of responders and support people that was coming to the scene. And it was an international support. One of the key things we had to do, and you see it under the safety officer that Arnold mentioned just a little while ago, this was a dangerous scene. We had areas that were still collapsing. We had 18 huge cranes operating in there, and we had to take care of the people that survived the collapse, but now we're operating in the rescue operation. And one of the most important things we did was every day we put together a safety plan and told people what respiratory equipment to wear, where you could operate, and where you can't operate. It's really not a good place to stand underneath a structure that's being taken down by a 200-ton crane and you're 50 feet away from a structure that's a few hundred feet high or 50 meters high. So this structure that you see in front of you becomes a way of managing the incident. So let's dive down into the particular structures, and we'll move to what is operations. Operations is the key of everything. This is the doing stuff and organizing it. What we did at the Trade Center, because it was geographically divided by the collapse of the buildings into 4 different sections, and we were able to response and recovery. We were able to separate our sectors into 4 geographical areas. But looking at the slide, we can separate things into geographical areas. We can separate into functional areas, like search and rescue teams can be in certain areas, and it's an idea to organize and to manage it. And it's also to let everybody else know what everyone is doing. We can have it, certainly a lot of these events, there's a security force that needs to be in place, and that's their own operation. And then there's an emergency service group. How do we feed and shelter people? How do we take care of medical needs? So we can split this up in all different ways. There's not one particular way to do it. But what's important is to start to develop a structure where we can communicate to each other. You can communicate verbally if you're in a particular group, and those groups can communicate horizontally. The operations section is all the doing, and there's no particular way of organizing it. It's just that certain principles must be adhered to. People have one way of reporting. I report to one boss, and that goes up a chain of command, and it goes horizontally across to other areas. We find in the United States the military has their own structure, and very similar to military operations in other countries. Well, we're not going to take over their structure using an incident command system, but we will connect to their structure, and we will know what is the military doing, what is law enforcement doing, what's the search and rescue teams doing, what's the building assessment teams doing, what are the sheltering group doing, and we'll share that information across. The operations section really limits the span of control to smaller groups. When we try to command everything centrally from one command post, we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it at the Trade Center. what we had to do was split it into smaller sections and have those sections report to a unified command. Let's move to the next slide, and we'll talk about planning. This, during 9/11, was my section. I was the planning section chief. What this allows us to do is it allows us to track resources. Who do we have operating? Where are they operating? Really important question. Who do we have here? Dangerous location. We should really know who we have and what they're doing. The situation unit is what's the status of what's taking place, and what does it look like? So what we used a lot of maps, and you see in the center photograph, this was a aerial photograph taking of the World Trade Center, and we superimposed the footprints of the buildings, that we have a sense of where we were standing. We further divided that into sections, and we provided these maps to everyone at the site. Really important to have information. A lot of documentation was taking place. We had to document where we found every victim. And at the World Trade Center, there was 2,750 people died. And the ones we recovered, we had to document where we found them, not only for legal reasons, but family members also wanted to know. And we provided that information if they asked. As units, we supply units to the scene, we also have to demobilize. People can't operate forever. So we have to have a relief system where they come in. In this case, we have people come in for 12 hours, and we're off for 12 hours. That's about the most anyone can work. And you only can do that for a short period of time before we burn out our people. But it's having those records and able to rotate people in and out. There's technical specialties. We had people taking air samples. We had people that advised us on how to put out fires that were burning for 4 months. The specialist on a pandemic is critical. So it's important to have those people. But I want to make a couple points on this slide. And you see on the right-hand side, there's mobile mapping. With the technologies, this technology has improved so greatly, we can use a mobile device and push information and maps to people. Where we have our resources deployed, where are the dangers or areas, what do we want to do, we can all put on a map. Now the planning section actually revolutionized the entire operation at the World Trade Center. We did two things, and I want to emphasize these two things because it was new to us at the time and made a major difference in the operation. One is we had a planning meeting of all the key representatives from different agencies. And we had a meeting every morning at 7 o'clock of 100 different organizations being represented. Every military, every first responder, medical, a number of NGOs, and international, Red Cross, they all showed up for the same meeting. And we took the notes at the meeting and we published what we talked about in the meeting into an incident action plan. This is a written document of the resources provided to the scene, the mapping, and the safety plan, a communication plan. But most importantly, what we did with the incident action plan and what we did at our meeting, we asked 3 questions. What did you accomplish in the last 24 hours? So what did you do? Next question is, what are you planning to do for the next 24 hours? So there's an understanding amongst the group of people what we did and what we're going to do for that short period of time. And then we asked a 3rd question, looking a little bit further ahead, what are we planning to do for the next 72 hours? Simple questions, but when you get 100 different agencies in the room, it has to be clear and coordinate what we're doing. And we did. So if part of the building was being taken down, we had to coordinate with construction companies. And we had 4 construction companies, huge construction companies operating. And we had to coordinate with our rescue operations. Now that incident action plan that listed resources, what we did, what we're planning to do, our communication, our safety plan, all the mapping, that was published every day, and that was the most sought after piece of information. We sent out hundreds of incident action plans because it started to organize. People knew what they were going to do, what their resources were, and what everybody else was doing. It really became an important document, which we, at the time, reprinted. Now, with smartphones and tablets, it's easy just to push that out electronically. But the planning section was a critical part of developing ICS from the bottom up. We asked the people in the field what they were doing, and we simply put it into some documents. And that started to form an order. We go to the next slide. If planning is information, then logistics are things. What equipment do I need? And there was a lot of equipment used at this particular disaster. Whether it's a terrorist event, a hurricane, a tsunami, an earthquake, buildings are collapsed. And we need equipment to dig people out. So the logistical section orders equipment, keeps track of the equipment, and allows the response community to operate. We literally had the size of 2 warehouses operating full of supplies. Not only personal equipment and things to dig with and plywood, all sorts of equipment. They were literally the size of 2 warehouses, and that had to be managed and had to be tracked, the equipment given out. There was communication. When disasters hit, especially large-scale disasters, one of the first things we need to do is to develop, to put back a communication system. How do we talk to our responders? How do we talk to the people that are affected by the area, so we can set up cell sites and internet and radio communication? But that task we have to task to somebody or a group of people. There's a medical unit, not for the people that are affected by the disaster, but by the response community, by the NGOs, the people that we're bringing in to help. Well, we got to take care of their medical needs. We also got to feed them, and we got to shelter them. One of the biggest problems we've seen with hurricanes and Hurricane Katrina, particularly when we responded to that, was that people show up and they expect to be fed and to have shelter. Well, now you become a problem for me if you can't take care of yourself. And if we're going to use different agencies, then we better figure out how to feed it and shelter and supply them with the right equipment. The best is for them to bring their own, but that always doesn't happen. Even moving people around becomes a process. With roads closed, trees blocking roads, so a ground support becomes a major issue. But the sense I like to give you here on the logistics is that logistics solves the thing problem. What do I need? What equipment do I need? And how do I get back and forth? That has to be delegated to some particular group to support all the international and national help at the scene. It would be nice to know if I could get a truck down a particular road, or to be able to be transported, or to get supplies transported to a particular area. So that's what logistics does. As we move to the next slide, finance and administration. Without getting too involved or overwhelmed by this, because this is the last thing we like to think of during a disaster, but it's something we do have to be concerned about, because things come down to money and time. How long are people operating, and what is it costing? Sooner or later, somebody has to pay for it. Certainly, there's a lot of goodwill and people extending themselves and donating things, but we've got to keep track of that. If I order a backhoe, a grappler, to help dig out a building that's collapsed, well, the equipment and the people who operate with the equipment, sooner or later somebody's going to give us a bill, or give somebody a bill. Our first responders, they don't work for nothing. They certainly will do everything to volunteer and come on their own time, but we still need to track it and keep track of the time. And if somebody gets hurt, and we've noticed that people even now are suffering from ailments that occurred from the Trade Center, respiratory injuries and cancers that came years later. Well, we need a record that these people were actually at the site. So that whole administration section keeps records of the cost. Let's move to the next slide, and I think this next slide is a really important one. How do we develop an incident management system from scratch? It would be nice if we had all these trained people and the international community, everything was operating under one system, and we all knew the different boxes that showed up on the screen. But very often that doesn't happen. And even within the New York City Fire Department, where we train people, well, people aren't experts on the incident management system. So what we've found out is to have a group of special people, what's called an incident management team, trained in incident command. They're not the ones that take over. They do not take over the system. They support the executive sponsors, the management system. They're support. And let me give you a real example. You see on the lower left-hand side, there's a tree outside one of the collapsed buildings of the World Trade Center. Well, after the buildings collapsed and we were trying to develop a command system, I was standing in front of our command post, one of the firehouses we converted into a command post, which was just about a half a dozen blocks from the World Trade Center. And someone came up to me and said, "I'm the incident commander for the incident management team from the southwest of the United States. We deal with big incidents on wildland fires all the time. We're from the Forestry Service, and we can help you. Chief, we could help you out." And I looked at this guy from the Forestry Service, and I said to him, "Wait a minute. There's only one tree left at the World Trade Center. How are you possibly going to help me out when your expertise is in wildland fires?" And he turned to me and said, "Chief, you got it wrong. It's not that we deal with wildland fires. We're a team that deals with an incident management system, and we could help you command the operation." So I brought him upstairs, and the people I was with, my supervisors who were actually in charge, said, "Yeah, do whatever you want with them. We're just too busy." What I did was I had them work for me as planning. And little by little, again, from the bottom up, we created a structure. We created a structure so we could operate, that we could operate in. And we influenced the senior managers of not only the fire department, but every agency that had any connection to that operation we were able to influence, including the many civilian agencies and that came to the scene. The picture on the right-hand side is the tents we set up for Hurricane Sandy. So a decade after 9/11, a little more than a decade, we developed our own incident management team, and we used that team to help manage the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy for the city. This was actually set up a couple months after, when the city had so many people that were displaced and needed to help get people back to their homes or long-term shelters, and we were able to operate for the city and in the Office of Emergency Management. So one way, and I'd like to talk about this in our discussion in a little bit, is can an incident management team help humanitarian disaster work by coming in with a number of expertise that helps support and create a system for those that are in charge of the disaster. Now, this is everything Arnold and I talked about, and it looks very confusing. But that's why I think it's important to bring in an incident management team to help support an operation that has done this before. It is really a support function, and it helps define a unified command where we have more than one person in charge. Because any disaster, there's not one person in charge. Whether it's in the United States or any other country, there isn't a single person. There's a group of people, key people that help manage an incident, and supplying information and being able to understand the operations, the information part of the planning section, the things that we need for logistics, and the money on the finances is the easiest way to look at it. But let me turn this back to Arnold for a couple slides, and then it'll be great to get into some questions.
Thank you very much, Joe. Looking at this ICS functional structure, I think one point to make is that incident command or incident management does not have to be this complicated. Organizations that are committed to using this system, like fire departments in the United States, use it to manage very small incidents as well as very large ones. And they will operate with partial system when dealing with a small incident, say sending a single fire engine or 2 fire engines out to deal with a burning car or a slightly larger incident in which a home is on fire. They will mobilize only the parts of the system that are needed. But extremely important is the fact that this system is extremely flexible, and that means that it can increase in size and become much larger to deal with more complicated incidents that last longer, that span much larger geographic areas. All the while, it is set up so that a manageable span of control exists, so that the people who are working directly together are able to coordinate effectively, whether they're in a, and that span of control then builds so there are multiple levels. Joe mentioned unified command and the existence of multiple leaders. Sometimes this is because there are individuals, but often the need for unified command exists because there are multiple organizations that are playing key roles in the response. And those organizations may have either legal reasons or strong organizational imperatives not to give up control of their resources, not to submit to the command of a single organization. And this is where the civilian incident management system differs from the analogous systems that operate in the military, which has a stratified chain of command and unity of command leading up to a single commander. In incident management in the civilian sector, it does not require that there be a single commander. Instead, there can be a coalition of people who play the command role. And indeed, the term command, although it's widely used, is in many respects a misnomer in this situation, because the unified command is not commanding other entities. It is in fact a voluntary coalition in which people are collaborating because they want to have an effective, coordinated response, but they are not surrendering control of their people or their resources. They are simply participating in a coordinating structure that pulls things together across organizations. In the humanitarian sector, in the last decade, the cluster system has developed, but I think one of the big differences between the cluster system and the incident command system is that incident command is tied together across the major functions as depicted here: operations, planning, logistics, and finance and administration. And so the overall coordination structure, I think, is somewhat stronger than tends to be true in practice in using the cluster system. In addition to flexibility, IMS provides a certain amount of standardization. We've talked already about chain of command and span of control. I want to emphasize also the terminology, that people who are trained in this system have similar ways of referring to things, and that common terminology makes it much easier to coordinate when people come together, perhaps even in an international setting, where they may have different terms that are likely to confuse people when they work together. Similarly, there are similar processes that range from the daily incident action plan development that Joe described to many others, and that standardization of process also works to make it easier to coordinate. Critical to this system are the boundary spanning capabilities. It can go across different professional specialties, across different agencies, across jurisdictions, across sectors, from the public sector to the NGO sector, perhaps including the private sector and business organizations that might be able to contribute to emergency responses. It promotes information sharing. The system systematically works both through the kinds of planning processes that Joe talked about, to briefings when shifts change, and information flows both vertically, up and down, and also horizontally across the elements of the system. It allows for the effective division of labor and resources so that people know what they're doing, so that there is a minimum of duplication and also a minimum of leaving out sectors that might be left uncovered because one organization is working one place, another place, and a certain area might not be covered. And quite critically, in operations that last for extended periods, not just 1 day or 2 days, but weeks or even months, as is true in humanitarian response to major disasters, the system permits relief on a 24-hour basis. It creates, because of the standardization of jobs, it means that people are able to move in and comfortably take over work that has been done by someone else because they share the kinds of training and experience in that particular specialty that makes them effective. Let me now turn this back to Joe to conclude our oral presentation by talking about some myths and misconceptions that sometimes exist.
Yeah, thanks, Arn. A lot of times we think of ICS as just a military operation, just for fire departments, but it's not. It's not. We have used it on different occasions. We are using it on in New York City on the Ebola incident and how to manage that. I think no matter what disaster happens, we need to start to organize in some sort of fashion. People will naturally move to some organization level. And if we don't do that, we'll be very frustrated by being disconnected. So I think ICS is just one way of doing it. It's a flexible system, as Arn said, and it doesn't tie anyone in to one particular way of doing things. What it does, what I like to refer to, is that it connects people together. It creates conditions for collaboration and coordination, and that is so important. Command is part of it, but I don't like the term. I rather say it helps to manage the groups of people that are coming in. We provide joint sense making. We leverage each other's understanding of the problem and how to solve the problem. So from my own experience, it's been very helpful during major disasters to have a system. The system allows us to lead. If I have to be worried about every part of communication, sheltering, who's here, who's not here, then I can't step back and lead. So those that are in senior leadership positions during a disaster needs to have some sort of system that will start to manage the things that need to be done, so we can step back and look at the bigger picture on saving lives and trying to bring people back to a sense of normal after these devastating events. Paul, we'll throw it back to you for some questions.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for that. We have quite a lot of questions here. We had some questions that were sent in by participants before the meeting started, and we've had a steady stream of questions coming in during the presentation. There's a lot in what you've told us, and I was particularly struck just at the end there when you talked, Joe, about this being a system allowing us to lead, allowing people to lead, and I think that's very important in the context of the ALNAT work. And I was also really struck by one thing, again, having read this in Arn's book, the separation between operations and planning that occurs structurally in the ICS system, which one very seldom sees within humanitarian organizations' offices or indeed within humanitarian coordination teams. And that's just that in itself seems to be a really interesting idea. On questions, diving into one which has been asked in a variety of ways by 2-3 people, and it goes to the point that you were making there, Joe, about hierarchy. I think the sense among many people who don't know ICS particularly well that it is quite hierarchical and quite top-down, and that particularly it can be seen by people on the ground in a humanitarian context. You know, if you have a situation now where you have country offices who are fighting Ebola in Liberia or Sierra Leone, and you then have an ICS system which is sort of imposed upon them from headquarters in London or Washington or wherever. But this can be seen as a very top-down, very hierarchical system. And I wondered what your experience of, your thoughts on that are. Is that a legitimate comment? And how have you found that people on the ground who are doing their best to respond to an emergency have responded to an incident command system being put in place?
That's a great question. When you look at those charts, it looks very much like a top-down. You have a commander at the top and everyone underneath that, and it feels, when you look at it on paper, top-down. However, it's been my experience that it's been just the opposite. It really has been a bottom-up. It's created from the bottom up. And for those organizations that are out doing good work, you don't have a voice unless you plug into a system. Matter of fact, the only people that you're communicating with are your own people. However, if that voice you have starts to build into a system and say, hey, I need some help over here. This is an area where people are most in danger or suffering the most. So I think if we get away from the charts and we look what's happening on the ground, It gives people a voice. It's built up from the bottom up, and they see that as they send around an incident action plan that says, oh, I'm part of this. I'm part of this system, and I've influenced that system, and I do have a voice.
I think there's one other element of this. Implicit in your question, Paul, was the idea that the incident command might have, in Liberia might be commanded from London. And in fact, the incident command structure that we've described that appears here, the incident command would be on scene, so that this, and indeed in an operation, if this were being used in Liberia, in fact there would be a number of separate incident commands, perhaps one in the capital city and one outside the city, so that these are much more compact, where people can get to each other, interact physically. It's not something that's run from thousands of miles away. There is a structure that pulls together individual incident commands and creates a larger superstructure, but the incident command itself is quite independent and operates with a great deal of cohesion and independence, and is only loosely coordinated above that level. As you know, we'll be doing a second webinar sometime after the first of the year and talk about some of these much more complex events and how individual incident command structures can link up across a very large geographic area. But I think the basic structure that we've talked about today is in fact a local one.
Thank you, Arnold and Joe. In fact, if I can just take this a little bit further, because it relates to another question that's just come in. Incident command is very scalable, as you mentioned. It's it grows as the emergency grows. We have a terminology. I don't know if this is used in command called step aside, where sometimes an individual director is asked to step aside for someone of a higher rank because the situation has got bigger. Is that something that occurs in incident command? And if so, how do you deal with the, understandable sort of implications for bruised egos and so on?
The interesting thing about the incident command system is those people that operate within the system, there is no rank. So we have different ranks reporting to each other in a kind of upside down way, because the idea is to function in each of those operations: planning, logistics, and administration. So there isn't a particular rank structure, but to take care of people's bruised egos, and certainly in every situation there is some sort of a hierarchy, but I think we do that in incident command, as you see on the screen, by having a unified command, by saying you're part of, if you're one of the key players, you're part of it, that you're part of the unified command system instead of trying to choose just a single commander. And I think certainly in New York, where you have police and fire and a whole bunch of other agencies, it has worked well for us by it being very inclusive.
Great, thanks, Joe. If I can move on to another area that some of our colleagues have been asking about, which is, and again, this is something that you brought up briefly, is the degree to which you think that this approach would be useful and might need to be adapted for much longer term response. If we think about sort of international responses, humanitarian responses, you will have those which are, flooding, which I know is very similar to New York, or cyclone response, but also there'll be things like drought emergencies, which will tend to go on for months and which might be quite long in the gestation and quite long in the response period as well. Do you think these systems have something to offer those longer term crises, if you like, where it's not so much an incident that you're managing, but just a sort of almost a chronically bad situation?
I think they do. One of the important features of this system for such extended duration events is the ability to shift leadership, to have people commit and work very hard for a limited period of time and then to shift and have a new leadership team come in for another period of time and to have them replaced. In the Wildland Fire Service in the United States, where this system has been used for the longest, which fight these very large forest fires, an individual fire may last for months. And the incident management teams that are sent in, the kinds of high-level elite teams, very experienced, where people have earned their way on to these teams by their demonstrated competence in previous events, those teams come in and work for about 2 weeks. They consist of about 40 people who divide up into 2 teams that work 12-hour shifts and then have a rest period and then come back. And those teams work very hard for 2 weeks, managing the incident, leading the different sections of the response, and then with 1 day of overlap with another team, they are cycled out and the second team takes over. They work for 2 weeks, and after another 2 weeks, a third team may come in, and eventually the first team may come back and serve another shift, depending on how long it lasts. Of course, the people there are in a forest fire situation. There are thousands of people in addition to those teams, and those people are turning over as well. But having that elite leadership team that manages intensely but is replaceable, I think, is one of the strengths of the system, and it prevents people from burning out, or at least reduces the possibilities that they will burn out, and ensures that there is strong leadership throughout the response. So I think that could easily be adapted to extended duration humanitarian responses for incidents like drought or perhaps civil conflict or whatever. It might be somewhat different, but I think the idea of having replaceable leadership is essential.
Just a couple of quick examples to remind people. 9/11, it went on for 9 months, the recovery operation. Hurricane Sandy we did for 4 months, where we used the incident management system and the incident management teams. So we can definitely use this system to manage all sorts of problems.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that's a very helpful reminder, actually, that these things go on long after they've moved out of the news, perhaps, and that's something that the humanitarian sector knows very well. We've had a really interesting question come in here from a colleague who tried to use ICS in the Lebanon response as part of I assume as part of the Syria regional response. And saw a real disconnection between planning and operations, because the planning group was seeing things holistically and kind of taking a bird's eye view, and the operations section were dealing much more with details, and so it wasn't really meshing together very well. I wonder, if this is something, Joe, that you've had experience of, and if so, how do you go about bridging that kind of gap?
That's a great question, Paul. I think the value of having an incident action plan solves that, and having meetings, because what happens is that the planning section runs the meeting, and it asks operations, what do you need, and what do you need for support. So everything focuses back to operations, and everything supports operations. So I think by having a meeting and understanding what's going to take place and putting in writing, so for operations, that written plan is what they're going to do, opposed to being just strategic. So there needs to be this combination of strategic and boots on the ground tactics. The planning, logistics supports the operations.
I think one other thing to note about this is that these meetings take place at least daily, and in very fast developing situations would take place even more frequently than daily. The separation of planning from operations is not meant to be dramatic. It is meant to be, they are separate, but they are integrated, as Joe has indicated. And the great virtue of it is that operations by its nature tends to be short-term oriented. It tends to be focusing on what's going on now and perhaps what's going on a few hours from now. The planning section, therefore, can focus on the next operating period, whatever it is, another shift or another day, but it also can look farther out and think about what needs to be done the next week or the next month. It can start thinking about, and during that period of time you may be scaling the operation up substantially, or you may begin to scale it down and then completely demobilize. If operations were in charge of planning, those longer time period planning activities would likely get driven out by the requirements of current operations and would be done, if at all, would be done more superficially. So having a separate planning function allows you to focus on those things and make sure that those kinds of extended duration planning is actually going on.
And yet, if I hear correctly, it's simultaneously doing that, but it's also ensuring that crucially the needs of the operational side is being met there. Kind of, what do you guys need? Right. And that, I think, is very interesting when one thinks about how things often happen. There's a lot of criticism in humanitarian world about the extractive nature of kind of information collection. A lot of stuff is being pulled out of operations. A lot of information is being pulled out of operations so that it can feed headquarters or it can feed kind of long-term strategy development. But there's often a criticism that very little information is being provided or very little support is being provided for operations. So I think that's a really interesting correlative and a really interesting answer. Thank you.
Let me just add one very brief thing, which is that Joe was emphasizing the way in which the planning meetings include operations. I think it's also important to recognize that in the overall structure that the incident command will meet with the heads of the operations section, the planning section, the logistics section, and the finance section regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. And so at the highest level of the incident command, it is pulling together all of the functions and not allowing them to sort of float off and operate on their own and operate in a way that doesn't take account of the needs of the other groups that are functioning.
One of the participants was asking exactly about this. We've talked very much about the roles within the functional structure, but what then is the role of, I believe it's the EOC, or the central sort of incident command structure at the top, sitting above that? You know, what is the role then? And Arne, I think you began to talk to that just a second ago.
Joe, why don't you respond to that though? And
it comes back to Paul, what you actually said in the beginning of this webinar. It comes back to leadership. The incident commander or incident commanders, those unified command, is really about leadership, and it's connecting the operations section, the planning, logistics, and administration, connecting that together, that they're all working as one unit on a particular strategy or vision. The unified command sets the objectives. What do we want to do as a group, as groups? Because remember, the unified command is more than one. What are we doing as a group to manage the incident? So I think it comes back to looking at the incident command, unified command, as a leadership role, and then everything below that, the operations, planning, logistics, and administration, as managing that.
And of course, that leadership role includes both problem solving, so things that don't get worked out within functional specialties but need to be perhaps argued out or coordinated at a higher level. And it also means relating to whatever structure exists above incident command, to the leadership of a community or to a state or province or even to a national leadership, so that there's a connection to the larger structure of response that exists above the incident command.
Just a question about the degree to which ICS or similar mechanisms are used outside the USA, Are you aware of other countries using them? I know that Bangladesh, for example, does. And do you have any experience of their success or failure outside the cultural context of the United States?
We've used the incident command system in Haiti when we sent our USAR team down, Urban Search and Rescue Team, and I know other Urban Search and Rescue teams uses the elements of incident command. So that's been my experience. But Arnold, I'll let you talk further on that.
I think that this system, as a system, labeled incident management or incident command, is not widely used outside of the United States. But I think the elements of it and essentially the guts of it, whatever it happens to be called, is widely used by military organizations in many countries. There are systems in other places that have features of this. So in the United Kingdom, the gold, silver, bronze system has some similarities, although also some differences. So I think that on the military side, this is used quite widely, but used in a more hierarchical way than it is on the civilian side in the United States.
Great, thank you. And if anyone is listening, participating in today's webinar and does have examples, we've come across examples in Bangladesh and also Australia. But if anyone is listening and does have examples, do please send them in to alnap@alnap.org and we will circulate them to the group. I think that takes us on to the so what question in a way, which I kind of, we've had quite a lot of our colleagues here have put in questions on, or which are variants of the so what question, which is, what is stopping our organisations, our international humanitarian organisations, the United Nations, the NGO sector, from taking this up? And what do you, as the last question to you, what do you think our sector needs to do as of tomorrow to actually start bringing some of these principles into our work?
Certainly one thing that is an obstacle, or two things that are obstacles, are the sheer number of humanitarian organizations and the diversity of those organizations, some of them being locally oriented exclusively, some of them being nationally oriented, and some of them being internationally oriented. So obviously the world is a much more complex place than a single country, even a big one like the United States. And a second factor is that the number of response organizations that are mobilized in a given operation may be extraordinarily large. Haiti is perhaps or the Indian Ocean tsunami, both being examples of situations in which there were hundreds or even thousands of NGOs as well as government and other kinds of agencies present. What needs to be done to make this happen, I guess, is leadership needs to come from several places, perhaps. Certainly the UN system would need to decide that this would be a good thing to do. It might also be that leadership could be undertaken by some of the large international NGOs and smaller ones that were interested in participating. The United States has developed this system and diffused it among professions and jurisdictions over what is now approaching a 45-year period. So it may well take a long time for this to spread out. I think some big organizations need to commit to it. They need to train their people. They need to gain experience using it perhaps in some smaller situations first, and then have some successes with it that will demonstrate its value and encourage others to adopt it. There are a lot of misconceptions about having to give up autonomy, that organizations are taken over by some command structure if they agree to participate in this. And I think some of those myths need to be dispelled through positive experiences so that people will recognize some of the benefits of improved coordination and recognize that some of the apparent downside risks are much smaller than they may have feared.
Thank you, Arn. Thank you very much for that. Before I go on to sort of talking about some of the things that we may all do together to take this agenda forward, I'd just like to note a couple of things that have come in from participants. Kevin from the US Forest Service, just speaking to the issue of top-downness, has said that one of the reasons that ICF is often seen as top-down is because it's presented by itself without reference to relationships between various different organizations within the unified command system and the context within which it's working. I think that's a very good point. Thank you, Kevin, for that.
And I might say, Paul, that as you well know, our plan is in the second webinar is to talk about more complex situations. We focused today only on the ICS or IMS framework at the incident command level, but to talk about in the second webinar to expand out to more complicated situations and the way that an individual incident command may interact both with side-by-side incident commands and by the larger structure of the response to government and perhaps higher levels of government or even internationally.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up, Arn, because I was just going to mention where we go from here, and I think this second webinar is eagerly, judging by the questions, is eagerly awaited by many people, so I'll come on to that just now. I just wanted to note as well that Marg Olson has said that Australia uses ICS based on the US model, and also that the US Forest Service, USFS, Forest Service or Fire Service, works with countries to develop national incident management systems in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Ethiopia. So, Marg, or anyone who knows anything more about those systems, it would be really interesting to hear what has occurred when those systems have been put into effect. In terms of what next, Arn, you kindly have agreed to come back with Joe, for which many thanks. We've been asked by several participants, where do we go from here? And maybe I can just briefly give a couple of thoughts on that. The first is that this project, this ALNAP project of the ALNAP network, is being very strongly supported by several organizations who are actively looking at how they can take some of the principles that came from the report that we recently produced, Between Chaos and Control, can take some of those principles and integrate them within their own organizations. And a lot of these are principles of incident command. So at the individual agency area, as you were suggesting, Arn, we hope that ALNAP member agencies, quite a lot of them, are going to be doing this work, and many of them were doing the work, of course, have been doing it for some time. If anyone participating is part of an ALNAP member organization and would like to consider how concretely this could be moved into training or could be moved into the organizational structures or procedures of your organizations, please do get in touch, because that's one thing that we're anxious to support. In terms of taking it forward, Arn, you mentioned the importance as well of kind of sort of pivotal agents, and we will talk about this in the next webinar. But we are working very closely with OCHA and the state team as well to talk about how some of these principles might be implemented at the level of the clusters and the country level architecture, so HCTs and clusters. And we'll be producing a report that will look at sort of effective coordination in the new year. So this is another area where we're trying to take this agenda forward. And of course, as you mentioned, Arn, we aim to continue this webinar series. I hope Joe and Arn have not been too put off, and we'll come back to talk more about the inter-organizational element of this, so exactly how ICS can be used in multiple organizational contexts. And we'll be setting a date for that webinar very soon. We will also be setting a date for another webinar where our colleagues from World Vision International, who have already put a lot of this thinking into their own organisational response, will tell us what happened when they took ICS ideas and used them in an NGO context. So we have a series of webinars coming up. And if anyone listening, taking part today, has ideas for things that they would like us to talk about, or indeed would like to present their own experiences, do please let us know about that. Similarly, if anyone online has any ideas beyond those that I've just outlined about how we might take this agenda forward, because we really do feel it has great potential, do let us know, whether ideas of meetings or people that we should be talking to, or ways that we, all of those on the call and beyond, should be working together. Please send an email to alnap@alnap.org on that. Also, I would suggest that if you haven't done so already, you look at the report between command and control, which brings out how a lot of these incident command ideas might be used in NGOs, the UN, Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. That will also send a link to you at the same time. And finally, great thanks to Team Rubicon and Chris Wharton, who have been sending in details of courses which people can access, training courses and other resources related to incident command systems. We'll also send that link around, so thank you very much for that, Chris. Thank you to all of you for your questions, and I really apologize we didn't get to all of them. Save them. We'll put them to Joe and to Arn next time. But thank you for taking the time this afternoon, or this GMT afternoon, wherever you are. And finally, thank you very, very much to the ALNAP team here, Leah and Maria, who put this event together, and to Joe and Arn, who have taken more time than was expected. We know extremely busy schedules to talk to us about this topic today, and who we look forward to welcoming back in probably a couple of months' time. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.